Joining us tonight, for those who are in the building with us, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse about 19. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse about 19. I told you, I hinted at this right at the end of our study last Wednesday that we started to talk about it, and then I thought, no, I don't want to cheat you out of an opportunity to ask questions or discuss it, and so I said, we'll come back to this moment in the text to be sure that we kind of pick up and have this conversation about Paul wanting to become all things to all men in order to be able to preach the gospel and to share that message of Jesus with others. And so that's where we're going to pick up our study here in just a moment in chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians, about verse 19. But before we go any further this evening, and by the way, thank you for those who are at home as well. I don't think I mentioned you all. But let's have a word of prayer together before we start. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this beautiful day that you've blessed us with. An opportunity to come and to study your word, to worship and honor you, and to appreciate the testimony that you revealed to us. Father, we still live in struggling times, but you have been with us throughout. You have strengthened us and encouraged us throughout our challenges, and we just pray your continued blessings. There are so many that need your strength and encouragement right now, and we just pray that you would let your comfort and peace and blessings fall upon so many. Father, go with us as we study together tonight. Give us the determination to live according to your will and standard, and use it to the best of our ability to understand it and make use of all of your will for all of us. And we pray this through Christ's name. Amen. So, Paul had this kind of interesting conversation, if you will, with the folks here in Corinth, and he challenged them to kind of respect his apostleship. He talks about various kinds of subject matters. Right before this moment, he talks about how important it is for him to have preached the gospel, and that he didn't take anything for it. Why? Why wouldn't he accept any pay at times for preaching the gospel? Okay, it was because he was trying to do it willingly. But what in particular did he seem to have concern about? Okay, of abusing that power, and we'll get. Okay, because it came from within him, and let me just take you there. Also, because he didn't want anybody to think that that's what he was about, that he was simply trying to preach. He didn't want anything to get in the way. He wants the gospel message to come to the forefront. He wants the message of Jesus to be the prominent thing that people think about. And so anything, any hindrance, any obstacle. By the way, real quick snippet, that makes a lot of sense in the kinds of conversations he's been having, right? He talked about, throughout this whole narrative, he's been talking about don't exercise your liberty if it's going to cause somebody to stumble. If it means never eating another piece of meat again, I'll do that to make sure others have nothing that's going to cause them to stumble or slip in their relationship with God. And so you see all this conversation that he's been having, and then he comes to this point in verse 19 where he says, "For though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more." I don't owe anybody anything. Why? Because I haven't taken anything from them. And you think about the kind of concept that he's been talking about. I haven't taken anything from anybody. So I'm not beholding to anyone. I'm not in debt to anyone and having to do things a certain way because of that. Because I'm free from all men, because I don't have those kinds of obligations, he can become what? Just a servant to all. He can become whatever he needs to be to anyone and everyone in order to accomplish what purpose? Preach the gospel, right? That's the end of the whole point that he's driving at. Go ahead, Bob. Right. And he certainly, to reiterate just quickly what Bob mentioned there, that Paul's wanting to exemplify the fact that he, to other apostles, whomever, that he certainly isn't in it for any kind of ulterior motive, and in particular not for money's sake. And Jesus very literally brings him to this purpose, though not against his will. I think he's going to say that before we're done here, but yet there's a very compelling reason for him to be preaching and teaching the gospel, and it has nothing to do with what he would financially gain. In fact, you could easily argue that Paul would have been far better off, probably financially, if he had just stayed as part of that group of Pharisees and kept working his way up the popularity ladder among them as it relates to that. And so he said very specifically then, I became all things to all men that I could preach to more of them. So unto the Jews he became what? As a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. So first segment or first slice, if when he would come to bring the gospel to those who had Jewish background, or those who had an understanding and appreciation of that Old Testament law, he would talk about those things. It wouldn't be a whole lot of advantage in some ways for Paul, or others for that matter, to take a Gentile who was completely oblivious to all things Old Testament and go, well, I want to tell you about Jesus, but I need to take you all the way back here to Abraham, and we're going to work our way forward from Abraham in order to get to Jesus. You could, in some senses, you could just kind of cut to the chase, right? With the Gentile, you could just bring to him the message of Jesus. But a Jew may want to think about that. He may want to think about, well, how does Jesus fit in this historical narrative that I've been involved in? Is he really the seed that was promised unto Abraham? And so you might talk to a Jew differently, or somebody who understands that Mosaic law. You may have a different kind of conversation with them. Paul says, I did what I could to understand my audience. If they were Jew or with the law, that's the way I spoke to them. If they are without law, verse 21, as without law, and it's interesting, he kind of caveat, not as if they were without law to God, but under the law to Christ. In other words, he's not saying that they didn't have any obligation to God, but the idea is they weren't part of that Old Testament system. Spoke to Jews and those under that Old Testament system as those who had come out of that. I speak to others differently. If you were weak, I became weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Paul says, I will do whatever it takes to communicate the message of the gospel to any audience I find myself under. Paul didn't have what we might call agenda-driven preaching. What I mean by that is sometimes we can get into our minds that there's only one way to communicate the gospel, that there's only one methodology to it, or there's only one angle that you can come at it, or only one approach. You can't manipulate what? Yeah, God's Word, the gospel itself, right? You can't manipulate truth. You can't pervert truth. You can't divert away from truth. So that's all a given. Paul's been clear about that anyway. That's not what we're talking about. Paul's saying, when I had an audience in front of me, I wanted to stop and consider, where is that audience? What's their history? What's their background? Where are their minds as it relates to Jesus before he determined how it is he would present the gospel? So here's my... Go ahead, Ken. I'm sorry. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry. And Kent makes a good point, and he points out the example of Philip and that Ethiopian eunuch, and the question that Philip asked him, do you understand what it is you're reading? And he preached to him Jesus from that narrative. We know that narrative, you go back into that text, was about, I'm asking, I guess, about Isaiah, right? I believe he was reading from the prophet Isaiah, and so Philip is a great example of somebody who found out where his audience, even though it was one man, his audience was in their understanding, and preached to him Jesus from that perspective. Paul did the very same thing. Go ahead, Bob, I'm sorry. Say it one more time, I'm sorry. I think when he speaks of under the law, he's talking about those under the Old Testament law, is what I've taken from that. Yeah. And I'm trying to follow that, and I understand, I think I understand what you're asking, but so he says, I spoke to unto the Jews, I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. By the way, stop for a second and keep in mind, this is, I want to say poetic, that's the wrong word, but this is kind of picturesque. It's analogy. He's trying to just illustrate, because he says, and unto the Jews I became as a Jew. Wait, well, he didn't have to become as a Jew, because he is one. He is one. So, and my point, Bob, simply is, I don't know that Paul's trying to give us, in some senses, some kind of specific thought process here. He's giving us illustration. So if I'm talking to a crowd of Jews, and so I'll become as a Jew in that conversation. If I'm talking to folks and they're thinking about the Old Testament law, and they're discussing things that came about under that law, then I'll have that conversation with them. If I'm talking to Gentile folks who don't understand the law, and only kind of understand their spiritual responsibilities, then we'll have that kind of conversation. I don't think he's trying to make some kind of specific point so much as he's just trying to illustrate how it is that he would become all things to all people. Yeah. 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 And I think they're picked up in his next statement about those not under the law. And again, I'm not arguing. And you're not either. I know that. We just I didn't see that. What I simply saw was him talking about. And by the way, were there some Jews who weren't living under the law? Yes. So you could say Jews generically, but you may have a totally different audience of Jews who were very dedicated to the law, and that conversation would be different than just somebody who had blood ancestry in them. That's what I saw. That's the distinction that I saw. I'm not saying I have to be right on that. That was just the distinction that I made there. And by the way, I thought of that myself in terms, is this a redundancy? You know what I mean? Jew and under the law, isn't that a redundancy? Aren't those the same thing? I don't think that's what he's trying to say. I think he's just trying to illustrate the various kinds of audiences. Some might be blood ancestry Jews. Some might be folks who are very dedicated to the Old Testament law. Some might not know anything about the law. And so I have to approach each of those audiences differently. So that's what I took from that. And that's a good point, Gary. What Gary said was that Paul's seeking to find common ground. That's a great tool, by the way, and it's an important tool that we should learn from. Again, finding common ground when you want to have a conversation about spiritual things is vital in some ways to gain that audience. If we have no desire whatsoever to have a reciprocal conversation, it's kind of hard to teach somebody in that situation. Go ahead, Amy. So I can. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And Amy's comments very well taken. Paul, the gospel is intended for everybody to be able to understand and put to use and make practical application of as it relates to everybody's salvation. Paul understood that that if he would, the better he could connect to every audience or every individual he was speaking to, the better chance he had to help them understand and grasp the concepts of the gospel. We got to be a little bit malleable. And again, we've already given the caveat, right? We've already given the qualifier that you can't pervert truth, you can't preach another gospel, you can't change the message. But we can certainly change our approach. We can change our attitude maybe at times. We can change our mechanisms for communicating certain things. There's not just one way to communicate. Case in point, anybody in the room right now that has more than one child knows exactly what I'm talking about. Right? If you've got more than one child, you know exactly what we're talking about because you've experienced it. Where you'll take the same set of facts and or information, but you got to communicate it completely differently to those children because one of them will grab it one way, another one will grab it a different way, and another one will grab it another way. And so you've experienced that. You know, Mom had 5 kids. I was easy to teach. The others not so much. You know, it was a little different. A little bit of work, right? You understand the point I'm making. We've got to be willing to do that. And I don't know. I'm not, sometimes you want to make a point of emphasis without sounding critical, but I don't know that we've done as good a job of that as we could have. I'll even rephrase it. I don't know that I've done as good a job as I should have. And sometimes when I'm trying to communicate the gospel, and I went at it as if here's the only way to do that. When no, there's not. There's lots of ways I could have done that, and I've got to do a better job of evaluating who I'm speaking to, what's their background, what do they know about the Scriptures, and what they don't know about the Scriptures. Just a quick illustration of that. It's I'm not going to say kind of hard. It's impossible. It's impossible to speak to somebody about genuine baptism if they don't know anything about the what 3 things: the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. You can't have a conversation about somebody going to be baptized into the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus, Romans chapter 6, without first starting at the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's just a quick illustration. We've got to be willing to have maybe the foundational conversations, but we see such urgencies sometimes, and we're so hopeful that somebody will render obedience to the message of the gospel, but we fail to do the things necessary to help them actually genuinely understand. And I would far rather, in some senses, be patient with the process of leading somebody to understand the message of the gospel that then brings them to obedience, than to compel or urge them into obedience to something they don't understand or know about. And they're solely responding and reacting to some command or instruction that they believe, well, I got to do this even though I don't understand it. Paul wanted the people to understand it. And so he communicated in whatever mechanism he had to. Yeah. And what Gary was mentioning is that Paul, and I think Paul's legitimately concerned about the well-being and issues that the people he was speaking to had. He wants to communicate in that fashion. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah. Yeah. And that's right. And each of them would have their own struggles. The Jew, and particularly those that were kind of law-abiding Jews, if you will, would have a hard time leaving all of those traditional customs and things. I think Paul even addresses that with those in Rome. When you get into Romans 14, that's what he's dealing with. He's dealing with folks who are struggling to know what to do with all those old customs and traditions. On the other hand, the Gentiles got all kinds of idolatry and paganism and worldliness. And so one's got a religious background that they have to kind of overcome. The other's got kind of a worldly background, but Paul wants to communicate to each where they are. And I think, again, that's a great lesson for us. We need to be willing to teach people where they are, rather than insisting them get to where I am first, and then I'll communicate. Say it one more time, Gary. That's right. Yeah, we can. We have to be careful not to act like I'm the only one with the answers here. I know it all, and I'm going to tell you. Again, that gets back to that reciprocal conversation. And that gets back to what Paul said earlier, by the way, not to get out of the narrative and text, but he said knowledge does what? Knowledge puffs up, but love works to the edifying of the person. So that gets back into this conversation. I don't think they're exclusive. I think they're inclusive to each other in this whole picture of this message. Even the idea, to the weak I became as weak, that I might gain the weak. You know, how we address those who are struggling and challenged is important for us to think about as well. How do I approach the weak? How do I approach those who are struggling with their faith? And Paul says that's a whole different kind of conversation. He again would just find ways and paths that worked for the circumstance. And this I do, verse 23, for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you. Know you not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize, so run that you may obtain. So Paul says the subject of the gospel and the benefit of salvation that it brings is so vitally important that I will become servant to everybody. I will speak and communicate in wherever they are, in whatever fashion I need to try to communicate the message of the gospel, because he makes the analogy that it's like a what? It's like a race, and it's like a race that only one person wins, right? Okay, never mind. I almost made a comment about society, and I'll leave it alone. Never mind. But only one person wins here, right? Only one person wins, and that's the picture. Usually, typically speaking, in a race, the person who finished the finish line first is the winner, right? They're the winner. Now, is Paul trying to say there's only one person going to heaven? No, he says you've got to run the race as if that. Put the energy, time, effort. It's that important. And it's that important to Paul that he would put the time, energy, and effort to learn something about his audience, to learn where they were in relationship to the gospel, because he wanted everybody to be able to run the race as if to win it, to receive the benefit and crown that God was offering. And those who do that, he says, every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. So those who want to win some kind of athletic competition, what if they want to be really good, what do they have to do? They got to be disciplined. They got to do the kinds of things athletically that allow them to become disciplined in whatever sport or competition they're going to find themselves in. And they'll be temperate in all things to try to make sure that they are prepared and ready to run to win. Paul says they do it for a corruptible crown. They want to win a trophy, or they want the accolade or reward of winning a race. We do it because we want to receive the incorruptible crown. We want to receive that eternal life. We want to receive that ultimate benefit that God will bestow upon the faithful. So I therefore run not as uncertainly, so fight I not as one that beateth the air, but I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means when I have preached to others I myself should be cast away. Paul says, I am confident in the benefit of receiving this incorruptible crown, and because it's so important, and I trust in the promises of God to such an extent that I'm willing to do whatever is necessary in order to get there. Not uncertainly, right? That's an interesting thought. I want you to think about it, because he makes the comparison about running as if only one wins. But if in the true analogy, if you had 10 people standing here and they're going to run a race, there's at least going to be some uncertainty among some in that group, no matter how confident they may be, that I may what? Well, 9 of them are going to be losers, right? 9 are going to lose. 9 are going to lose. But Paul says, so that's not the kind of race we're dealing with, Paul said, where there's uncertainty or one that just kind of flails in the air. I do everything with a purpose. I do everything with a goal in mind. I do everything to be sure that the end result is the benefit of salvation that I've been looking for. So I do what? Paul says. Okay. So I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. I will stay out of the worldly, fleshly lust. I will be cautious about anything that could persuade or lead me or influence me away from the benefits of the salvation that God intends for me. I will do everything I can to keep my earthly behaviors in line with what God would want from me, so that I might win this race, that I might finish this course and receive this incorruptible crown that God has promised. And by the way, that will lend right into what he's going to talk about in chapter 10 in a few moments. Yeah. Yeah. And it's a great point, Gary. Gary mentions that we ought to be disciplined in prayer, in study, in worship. All aspects of our spiritual walk, we ought to be disciplining ourselves in, exercising ourselves in, because those are the things that strengthen us, help us, guide us, and bring us to the ultimate crown that we desire. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah, yeah. And that's a great point. When you're running that race, you better be focused. And it's the same spiritually. We want to stay focused. Lay our treasures up in heaven and stay focused on that purpose and goal. Great point. Yeah. Yeah. And Kim's point's well taken. This is your responsibility. From the discipline part to the exercise part to the prepared part. And nobody can do it for you. Nobody can stand in your place. Can't do it in a regular race, and you certainly can't do it when it comes to the spiritual race. Yeah. Right. Just with as with our spiritual life, there's a starting point, but we have to stay at it daily if we want that hope of receiving the benefit. Go ahead, Ken. Yeah, when Paul makes that statement, he includes anybody and everybody that's willing to run the race, finish the course, keep the faith. There's a crown ready for any and all who will do and practice the very same things that he did. Yeah, yeah. And to repeat what Danny mentioned, Paul wants us to give all of us to it. He wants us to give every ounce of our being, keep our physical lives in subjection to God's will, in order that nothing interferes with our spiritual focus to bring about the salvation of our souls. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah. Yeah, there's all kinds of obstacles that Satan will throw at us, and we've got to be watchful for all of them. Yeah, this this isn't a kind of a straight line race that has no challenge to it. There are dips, turns, jumps. That it's a race that's challenging because of the obstacles that Satan's putting in the road. Yeah. If you have your question sheets, you can grab those out real quick. I'll show them to you on the screen as well. Just work through those for chapter 9. Normally I would save those till the beginning, or as a review before the next chapter, but with the time the way it is, we'll go ahead and look at these. So what was Paul's seal of apostleship? Say it one more time, sorry. But they were, right? The Corinthians were. They were his seal. The results of the gospel being preached unto them, they were the seal of his apostleship. Should a man be compensated for the work he does? Yes. And what quote or example did he use from the Old Testament is related to that? Yeah, don't muzzle the ox that treads the corn, out of Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, correct. Should it have been a problem for them to care for the physical needs of one who takes care of their spiritual needs? No, it shouldn't have been. If somebody was willing to render them that service, then they shouldn't think it a big deal on the other side. However, Paul would rather suffer physical need rather than disturb what work? Yes, preaching the gospel, the spread of the gospel. What does Paul mean in verse 14 when he says that one who preaches the gospel should live of the gospel? And basically earn his living from that source. What would bring woe unto Paul? Yeah, if I don't preach the gospel, then woe unto me. And did he preach it willingly? Yes. There's some compelling reasons why he's doing it, but at the end of the day, it's still his will and choice to do so. Why would it be woe unto Paul not to preach the gospel? It was entrusted to him. That's where the reward is as it relates to his work. What did Paul do in order to reach a variety of people? Yeah, it came to them. All things to all men, right? And that's been our conversation this evening. For the sake of what did he do these things? Yeah, the gospel, or the cause of Christ. How should one run the spiritual race towards heaven? As if there was only one winner. And what type of reward or crown are we seeking? Incorruptible, right? An incorruptible. And what had Paul done so that he would not be a castaway? He disciplined or kept his body under subjection so that he might not be a castaway. After he's preached to others about doing all these things, he wants to make sure that he fulfills and honors the will of God as well. And so I appreciate all that. To those of you who have joined us from home, we want to thank you for being with us tonight. We're going to sign off from our live stream here and let our audience have the last couple of minutes to finalize some of our conversations tonight. But again, we'll be back with you, Lord willing, on Sunday at 10 and next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. Thanks again for being with us.
Holy words long preserved for our walk in this world, they resound with God's.
You have been watching Growing in Faith, a weekly Bible study presented by the Paden City Church of Christ. We invite you to join us again on Monday morning for Drawing Closer to God, a period of worship, study, and praise beginning at 10 a.m. Our daily challenges can feel overwhelming, but as we grow in faith,